We are just over 2 weeks away until the start of the Stanley Cup Playoffs. This is what the Oilers' playoff path is going to look like.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to today's Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I'm your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, the number one stream sports podcast network. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where FanDuel is giving you a way to turn that energy into even bigger potential wins with college basketball parlay profit boosts. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. On today's very busy edition of Locked On Oilers, we are going to walk through a wide-ranging conversation about the Oilers' playoff path. We're going to start out talking about where the Oilers themselves specifically are, what they're on pace for, what's their most likely seeding finish, and who some of their potential opponents could be. In our second segment, we will give you the cliff notes for the Oilers' most likely playoff opponents. And then in our final segment, to round out today's show, we're going to walk through what I think is the Oilers' most ideal playoff path to get back to the Stanley Cup Final. So to start out, we have 77 games, not 87. Don't let Gary Bettman hear that. I don't want to play 87 regular season games. We have 77 games of data to understand the Oilers, to understand the NHL at large, and try and find the right context. And I was very optimistic on yesterday's show about the value of the last few weeks of the season, that over the course of the last 2 or 3 weeks, the Oilers had really shown you something they hadn't been able to dive into much this year and showed you a level of consistency they've greatly struggled to find for prolonged stretches. And that, in conjunction with some slumping in the teams around them in the Pacific Division, has enabled them to jump into first place in the Pacific Division as of the time I'm recording this episode. So right now, as we sit here, the Oilers are 39, 29, and 9. They have 87 points through 77 games, which is on the lower end. The Oilers' preseason over-under was 101.5 points on FanDuel, and that seemed high to me. It felt like the Oilers were a team primed for regression. Vegas as well, their team over-under was over 100 points as well. And coming into the year, the expectations were the Oilers would continue to maintain upper tier contender status. Maybe not the best team or one of the 5 best teams in the league overall, but a team that if things lined up well for them, they could make a run again. And a lot of the last 2 years making the Stanley Cup Final has been a byproduct of capitalizing on situations as they've arisen. And the Oilers have had opportunities over the last 2 years where they have played teams that arguably more talented, maybe individually talented player by player, but the Oilers have capitalized, whether it's against Dallas in either of the last 2 conference finals, against Vancouver 2 years ago in the second round, against Vegas last year in the second round. There is always going to be an inevitability that luck is going to come into play. Part of the conversation and part of becoming a perennial contender is taking care of business against the teams you're supposed to. You got to take care of that first round opponent in 5 or 6 games to give you a bit of a kickstart, to give you a little bit of momentum. And then you have the added bonus of not having had played as physically taxing a playoff series in that first round. And I think that's a lot of what's worked against Dallas and Colorado the last couple of years, where they've had to go through that gauntlet of a Central Division. And Dallas has gotten to the last 2 conference finals, which in and of itself is a pretty impressive accomplishment for one of the league's smaller markets in terms of hockey footprint. And right now, as we sit here, the Oilers are on pace for 92.6 standing points. We'll round up and we'll say 93. Based on having more regulation wins than the Anaheim Ducks, the Oilers hold the tiebreaker. Right now, the Oilers and the Ducks, they have the same record. They have the same they have the same points, but because the Oilers have more regulation wins, that is the first tiebreaker, and they have a significant lead in that department. I believe it's 5 or 6 regulation wins in comparison to the Ducks, who are 24, 25. The Oilers are at 29, I believe, if I remember correctly. And that difference is kind of trivial, that being the first tiebreaker. You know, you would think maybe it's division record, maybe it's head-to-head record, but in the NHL, we do regulation wins. And for the Oilers, who have 5 games remaining, based on their points percentage this year, they should get 5.6 points out of a possible 10. That would get you to the 560 points percentage they've played at this year, and that would likely manifest in the form of 3 regulation wins over their final 5 games. Now, of those final 5 games, 2 of them are against teams that are at present in a playoff spot, one of which is Colorado in the penultimate game of the season, which very well might have first place in the Central locked up at that point and might choose to sit guys, maybe give some AHLers a cup of coffee, get them in an NHL game just as a pay your dues type deal from the Eagles. But they have Utah tonight, Tuesday night. They have Utah tonight, Tuesday night. That's their most likely opponent right now, based on HockeyViz.com's projection outcomes for the remainder of the regular season. The Oilers will play Utah 36% of the time. Then, after that, they play the Sharks on the second half of a back-to-back on Wednesday. They have a 3% chance of playing the Sharks. Now, that would most likely mean the Oilers fell to one of the division spots, and the Sharks leapfrogged up into one of the division spots, which would require a lot lining up in their direction, a lot working out for them that maybe isn't the most feasible, but the Sharks are still mathematically alive. So that is going to be as do or die as it gets for the Sharks. Then, got a couple days off. Saturday night, you got the Kings who are 8% chance of being the Oilers' first round opponent. The Kings are 56% chance to make the playoffs overall. And real quick, San Jose, 22%, so about a little more than a 1 in 5 chance. And then the Mammoth, 98% chance to make the playoffs, which is really nice for a team that has been off in the abyss for a little while now. But then you have Colorado early next week. Colorado, 7% chance. That's the first round matchup. That would likely mean the Oilers lose out, fall to that second wild card spot because Colorado has all but locked up the first seed in the West, and that would be the matchup. The first seed plays the lower wild card. And then for the Oilers, and something that's exciting, and I didn't mention this on yesterday's show, and I should have, opportunities in front of you. The thing I love about sports at their essence is we can talk, we can blabber, we can write, we can podcast, we can do all of the pontification, we can do all of the research. At the end of the day, the 2 teams need to go out there and they need to play. For an Oilers team that has shown really nice stretches of hockey over the last 2 weeks, as well as having had a really mediocre regular season up until the start of March, who are you? What is your identity? Which team are you really? Are you the defense first, low event style team that we've seen find success over the last 10 regular season games in the absence of Leon Draisaitl that's played passable at 5-on-5, 20 for 20 goals for and against over the last 9-10 games, which is passable once you get an Oilers power play going again, you would assume. Once Draisaitl returns, the penalty kill has been really good in the game since Draisaitl got injured, the Jason Dickinson and Connor Murphy additions working there. And then the last thing I wanted to add in on that thought before we take our first break, nobody believes in us is a powerful motivator. Now, professional athletes are not like the rest of us. The rest of us, we rely on motivation. We have highs and lows, depending on how motivated we are, often dictates how aggressive our pursuit is going to be of said goal and how much we can do to achieve it. When it comes to athletes, they're going to at times need to make things up for themselves. You know, Tom Brady, most decorated player in the history of the NFL, 7 Super Bowls, multiple MVPs, multiple Super Bowl MVPs. Even in year 22 as a Buccaneer, he was still telling himself, nobody believed in you. You were the guy taken in the 7th round of the NFL draft. You're the guy who a bunch of teams passed over. You had to outwork guys your entire life to get here. You're old now. People are going to write you off because you're old. I point to the Philadelphia Eagles that won the Super Bowl with Nick Foles, who did the underdog gimmick of literally wearing the German Shepherd mask you would buy at a costume shop to incentivize, to motivate, to say, we might be the underdogs, and we like that. We like that you're going to undercredit us, that you're going to underestimate us. And I do think, even though the Oilers have made the last 2 Stanley Cup Finals and are the 2-time defending Western Conference champions, I do think there's a real chance people, including me, frankly, might be underwriting or undercrediting this team and what they might be capable of. We're going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we return, we'll do the cliff notes on who the Oilers could play in the first round, strengths, weaknesses, and key storylines. Workplace chaos, deadlines stacking up, inboxes overflowing, and the one position you have to fill, well, it's still sitting open. When the pressure's on and you need the right hire, that's a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Indeed sponsored jobs help you reach the people who actually fit what you're looking for, skills, experience, and location. So you're not just hoping the right candidate stumbles across your post. And the stat that says it all: in the minute I've been talking to you, companies just like yours will make 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed's worldwide data. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all of your boxes with Indeed sponsored jobs. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all of your boxes. Less stress, less time, more results. When you need the right person to cut through the chaos, that's a job for Indeed sponsored jobs. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your job the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now to support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? It's a job for Indeed sponsored jobs. Thank you so much to everybody who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are continuing our playoff conversation about the Oilers. And if you want to get more involved in the conversation, the link to join the Everydayer Club is down in the show notes. Get in the Discord server and embrace debate over the Oilers, the NHL at large, and the other sports leagues are in there, even though I'm mostly only talking about hockey. But continuing our conversation and trying to size up, frankly, I haven't had a great feel for who to expect the Oilers to play in the first round. I think because of how inconsistent the Oilers have been and how funky at large the NHL has been this year, where a lot of teams have had nice 2-3 week stretches and catapulted themselves back up into playoff conversations. Last week, the Predators were in the midst of a nice little run and found themselves in one of the last playoff spots. We've seen the Kraken, we've seen the Kings, we have seen the Sharks, we have seen a half dozen teams push for that last spot. The Winnipeg Jets come to mind as well in the West. Out east real quick, you have Columbus, you have the Islanders, you have the Flyers, you have so many teams in a really compressed area, Detroit and Ottawa as well, where they are all pushing for these last two spots. And that increased variance, that increased volatility is opening doors, because the fact that all you need is one good week to get back in the mix, you're not out of it. And look, we are running out of weeks. Most teams have 5 or 6 regular season games remaining at this point, and you're running out of real estate. And one of the good things for the Oilers is that they have largely afforded themselves a bit of breathing room here now. They may win the division for the first time in 30 plus years, which would be a nice accomplishment. Having home ice in the first round and the second round, would be a nice advantage. But as the Oilers last year proved, home ice is not of the utmost necessity for the Oilers to be successful. But one of the byproducts of having such a volatile standing situation is that you don't have a great feel for who you need to be anticipating. The last 2-3 years, we've had a reasonable understanding that it was going to be Oilers Kings in the first round. And not just that given year, but based on how the previous matchups had played out, you had a reasonable baseline for your scouting situation if you're the Oilers. And look, scouting in hockey, it's not like it is in baseball, where you're sending scouts or you're grinding the tape to pick up pitch mixes, where you're trying to find out strengths and weaknesses in certain game situations, righty lefty, off speed versus fastball. And in hockey, a lot of that pre-scouting and a lot of that determination of how you're looking for weaknesses, that's on the dry erase board. And then it comes down to execution. And some of that question mark and some of the questions I have are largely going to be predicated on that indetermination, that with 5 games to go, the Oilers could play 5 different teams in the first round, depending on where they finish. Right now, they are tied for first place in the division and have the tiebreaker over the Ducks, which is awesome. But you lose 3 of the final 5, and maybe you're in that first round series against Vegas or against Anaheim, and Vegas leapfrogs you, or Anaheim leapfrogs you. Maybe you have a really rough week and you only win 1 of the final 5, and you end up in that you end up in that second wild card spot, and that's how you end up in the small chance of playing Colorado. But to start out, most likely opponent at 36% of the time for the simulations that hockeyviz.com did, the Utah Mammoth. Utah, the Oilers have played reasonably well this year and found ways to win against. They beat them both times. I think Utah is going to end up falling into the boat of being happy to be here. I think I would compare them to what Ottawa was last year, where the Senators had put together a nice group of young pieces, but hadn't ever really broken through that glass ceiling and made the playoffs, put up much of a fight. And last year, they did a nice job at even strength against the Leafs in that first round series, and very well could have won that first round series with a bit better luck. And Utah has some really nice high-end talent. Clayton Keller has been one of the best and frankly most underrated players in the NHL for much of the last half decade. He was on the American Olympic team, somebody who I think has been one of the better two-way wingers in the game over the last handful of years. Dylan Guenther is probably somebody I was one of my most impressed in-person performances this year of the players I saw was Dylan Guenther of the Mammoth, who back in, I think it was February or January, absolutely smoked the Rangers. I want to say he had 4 or 5 shots on goal in that game, somebody with a lot of speed and a hard shot, and somebody who likes having their puck on his stick and really finds ways to make himself involved. And that's always a strong sign for a younger player. And Gunther's not a child anymore. He's quite a few years into an NHL career. But when those young guys come in with that assertiveness of, no, give me the puck, I'm going to make a play, that's really encouraging for their development and their upside that they don't show a lot of temerity. One of the other big things for Utah, Mikhail Sergachev, healthy this year for the first time in a while, played almost all of their games. I believe he's played 72 or 73 of a possible 74, 75 games, which is encouraging for a veteran guy who plays an important role. Is probably Utah's best defenseman. I like the Weegar trade for them, though I think Weegar is a little bit overrated for being a defense first guy, but is still an above average player. Utah, like what I'm going to say about Anaheim in a little bit, very unproven. And I think that plays to the Oilers' advantage. I think Utah, by virtue of being a team that hasn't been to the playoffs as this contiguous group yet, I think that bodes well for Edmonton. Of course, until it doesn't, sometimes these teams come in hot. I think about that Carolina team in 2019, in 2019, that after the Capitals won the Stanley Cup the year after, Carolina beat them in the first round. Carolina went on a nice little run. It's possible we see a team like that make a run. You know, I think about that first Leafs team that made the playoffs all those years ago with the Big Three and John Tavares, who got to a Game 7 in the first round earlier than anybody expected. It's possible Utah could do that this year. Next up, Vegas. Look, the John Tortorella thing makes this really hard to forecast. I think anytime a team has some burgeoning behind the scenes issues, I think it either gets entirely worse or it pops back and rubber bands all the way back around to being a net positive. Their goaltending issues are just as bad, if not worse, than the Oilers. Aiden Hill has been unplayable. Carter Hart has been really bad in the games he's played. And the other thing I'll add about Vegas, they have a lot of big game guys. That's the only real hesitation I have as far as the Oilers playing Vegas in the first round. You think about Eichel and Stone and Marner. I know Mitch Marner doesn't have a great track record. I think he's got like 10 points in 40-something career games, 5, 6, or 7s, which is not great. You want your superstars to be a point-per-game guy, but I think you throw that in there. I think the fact the Rasmus Anderson trade hasn't worked out particularly well is a little discouraging as well. And then real quick on the Ducks, the other team, those are the 3 most likely opponents for Edmonton. Anaheim's a very hot and cold team, and I think that's a byproduct of being extremely young, of having a lot of guys who don't have much experience, and they're less inclined. And I talked about this a lot on yesterday's show, the idea you want to be as close to that middle ground as you possibly can. You don't want to get too high when you're winning or too low when you're losing, and we've seen the Ducks go on 8-game winning streaks. We've seen the Ducks go on 8-game losing streaks, and I do think that is a byproduct of inexperience and young guys figuring it out, how to be NHLers at a high level consistently. And we will see over time if the Ducks can jump from being a nice, fun team into being a serious Stanley Cup contender. And only time can tell you that. On paper, they look like they're probably a year or so away. They get rid of some of those bad contracts. They upgrade at a few spots. They settle on which of the 2 or 3 big defensemen they've drafted highly over the last couple of years are going to be the ones they orient that group around going forward. But if you're the Ducks, the Oilers took care of them pretty well. And we're going to dive into that right after this. And after this break, we're going to go through these opponents, their head-to-head record with Edmonton, and what I think the best path for Edmonton to make it back to the Stanley Cup Final would be right after this. The MLB season is nonstop with East Coast thrillers and late-night starts. There is always something to get in on the action, and FanDuel is giving you a chance to get in on the fun. You can bet on a variety of markets, including game outcomes, player props, or specialized live bets after the game has already started. The MLB season is 162 games of opportunity. Don't miss out on yours. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. One more time, that's FanDuel.com to get started. FanDuel, play your game. Thank you so much to everybody that is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers ahead of the Oilers matchup with the Utah Mammoth tonight. We will have the normal episode for you after the game is over. And I got my notes over here and going through opponent by opponent. The Oilers have gone 2-1-0 against Anaheim. They've gone 3-1-0 against Vegas. They've gone 2-0-0 against Utah, and they've gone 1-0-1 against the Kings. So they have taken a 500 points percentage against all of their opponents. They could most likely opponents in the first round. The overtime loss to the Kings is a little frustrating, but on the season series, the Oilers have outscored the Ducks 16-12. They've outscored Vegas 13-13. They have outscored Utah 11-5. They have outscored the LA Kings 11-5. And I bring up those records, and look, I bring up those records for context, for framing my thoughts. And we know divisional opponents, there's a frequency, is habit understanding, and that familiarity can make it a real challenge at times to ride on what we've seen previously. It's really challenging to beat the same team 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times in a given regular season. Now, on occasion, you're going to have opponents where there is a talent gap that wide, where it's not out of the question you're going to beat them 7 out of 8 times, 6 out of 7 times. And most of the time, you're going to play a divisional opponent 3 or 4 times, and then you would need to win 4, obviously, to go through to the next round. So to win 6 or 7 of 7 or 8 possible games against an opponent, that's a real uphill battle. And a best of 7 series presents a lot of opportunities for a team that, like Anaheim or Utah, doesn't have a big track record of playing in those big games. I think that's a golden opportunity for where the Oilers and their veteran experience and their capacity to not get high or too low, I think that bears out a lot of worth in these playoff series, in particular in the earlier rounds, where that is a determining factor at times, especially the deeper you go into a playoff series. I often liken it to being in the deep end of the pool. If you know how to swim, you're pretty comfortable down there. But even if you don't know how to swim, if you do know how to swim and you haven't been down there before, you're a little more tepid in your movement. You're not going to be as assertive in your swimming as somebody who's been down there before. And divisional opponents have that familiarity. It's a little bit easier to build out your strategy. It's a little bit easier to build out your scouting reports and your tendencies. So much of hockey, especially in the defensive phase of the game, is based on tendency tracking. It's this guy likes to dump the puck in. This guy likes to carry the puck in. This guy likes to shoot the puck from here. This guy doesn't shoot the puck from here. These are all parts of that pre-scout that go into building out a game plan for the postseason. Now, you're going to generally build out from what you already do. You are not going to enact a widespread strategic change tactically in the playoffs. If anything, and we talk about this a lot here on Locked On Oilers, and my everydayers know this, we are a play better, not let's change how we play sport. Coaches do not have on-the-fly permutations the way they do in football or basketball, where they're getting killed off a certain set. You know, if a big and a guard are running a pick and roll over and over again, you're going to stop the switch. You are going to start aggressively switching as opposed to following the picks. If you're getting killed on the ground, you're going to bring an extra linebacker out onto the field and drop the defensive back and roll the dice that you might not roll the dice that they're not going to pass out of those lighter formations. And in hockey, it's changing. I will say over the last 5-6 years, we've really seen the better teams start to pull away in the earlier rounds of the playoffs. I think if I remember correctly, over the last 5 years, it's about 60% of the higher seeded opponents win over the lower seeded opponent, just specifically in the first round. And I bring that up because there's the perception of hockey being a high variance sport, which it is. In the regular season in particular, there's a lot more condension of components. Teams are a lot closer to each other over the course of a regular season, and a best of 7, where if you lose 4, you're done. The room for variance is a lot higher because the individual plays are part of a smaller sample. So, for example, if we play a 7-game series with 40 scoring chances per game, that is 7 times 40, which is 280. So 280 scoring chances. You do 1 divided by 280. That tells you on average what each scoring chance is worth. Over the course of an 82-game regular season, if we do 82 by 40, and I'm going to do that on the handy dandy Oilers calculator here. If you do 82 by 40, you get 3,280. That is 3,000, almost, that's like 5,000, something along the lines of a 200% growth, and exponential growth is hard to wrap your brain around. It's one of the things the human mind really struggles with, is exponential growth. It's part of why calculators are so helpful. But for me, I want Anaheim or Utah in round 1. I want to play a team that doesn't have a lot of playoff experience, that has to come into Rogers Place on the road, that is going to be loud. It is going to be an intimidating environment. And look, home ice advantage has become less valuable over time. I don't think it is as important as it may have been 5, 10, even 15 years ago. But I do think when it comes to teams like Anaheim and Utah that don't have playoff track records, I think you can learn a lot from those of how those guys handle adverse situations. I think you look at the way the Kings at times over the last couple of playoff rounds against the Oilers have wilted in those big spots. And I think the byproduct of not winning consistently in the playoffs, the Kings haven't won a playoff series since they won the Stanley Cup 12 years ago. I think that does wear on you. And I think if you're the Oilers, proving to yourself you can consistently win against playoff opponents the way they have over the last 3 or 4 years, I think that makes it a lot more plausible that even though the Oilers' regular season hasn't been the most well-rounded effort, I think you extrapolate some of the better components of the last few weeks in particular, and then you get to drop Leon Draisaitl in there, assuming he's ready for game 1 of the postseason, and you have a real chance to hit the ground running with some momentum and really carry that into an Anaheim or Utah series. Then I think they would play Vegas in the second round, and then you're probably looking down the barrel of Dallas or Colorado in the Western Conference Finals again. And I think the Oilers, if they can get through the first 2 rounds, will have proven to be good enough that they can hang with Colorado or Dallas. And even though Colorado or Dallas are more talented top to bottom, I think the Oilers have shown an ability to outplay their talent because of their stars over the last couple of years. On that note, that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Thank you so much to everybody who made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your teams covered every single day. For your second listen, go check out Locked On NHL Game Night, where the guys are breaking down all the action in these crazy wildcard playoff races. If you're watching over on YouTube, we send you to the first ever 24/7 national Locked On YouTube channel. I will talk to you guys tomorrow night after the game. Until then, let's go Oilers.